Hello, this is John Faithful Hamer. Welcome to the Likeville podcast. Today we're going to be talking with Ingrid Bejerman. Ingrid is one of the organizers of Blue Metropolis literary festival that's been happening here in Montreal for 20 years. 20 years, yeah. She's taught journalism, communication stuff at Concordia, and she's a journalist herself. Welcome, Ingrid.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I was wondering if you could just start off by telling our listeners about the Blue Metropolis Festival, because it's fascinating to me.
Sure. Well, the Blue Metropolis Festival is a multilingual festival, first and foremost. Actually, the first
What languages?
Okay, so lots of languages, but there's 3 official languages that started from the get-go, actually. English, French, and Spanish are the 3 official languages of the festival, and then depending on the year and the program, we have up to an additional 15 to 20 languages. We've had everything from Chinese to Farsi, and I'm proud to say that that last year, this last edition, actually in April, we had Quechua for the first time, an indigenous language of Peru, and the north of South America, actually. So
I've never even heard of that.
Yeah,
So what do you think literature is? I know it's sort of a broad question, but I've been thinking about this a lot lately. In the 21st century, what do you think literature is for?
That is such a huge question. That's a question that we've been asking ourselves as well, because we've seen in the last 20 years, the buzz around the intellectual and the author has changed so completely. We can tell by the number of books that are not sold. Actually, the way that books used to be sold out before, people would come see the author. There was like this aura around an author. That doesn't really happen anymore. It's a trend that we've seen everywhere. But I think also in terms of literary festivals, the trend is now that festivals become more festivals of ideas rather than literature, because the definition of literature has been reworked with the usage of the incoming usage of digital tools and just media and in general. So ours is also taking that direction as well, becoming more of a festival of ideas, of exchange of information around the idea of the public sphere, which is always, it's a 19th century thing, but it's changing the format of it, not being about the book so much as it being about literacy ideas, how to express them, how to interact, and Yeah,
because I find that if you go back a couple of centuries, Shakespeare was known not only to kind of highbrow people, but to the middlebrow, lowbrow, working class people knew his plays, knew his stuff, could quote lines from him. And so it seems to me increasingly, and this is what I want to kind of get at, is that literature seems to be something that is subject to the same trend that you see throughout our society, which is specialization. So you have engineers talk to other engineers, and biologists talk to other biologists, and architects to other architects. And so literature, increasingly, you go to a literary festival, not yours, but you go to most literary festivals, and it's just a bunch of other writers, and it's very incestuous, and it's very just small, right? I mean, Stephen Marsh was on the podcast about a month ago, and he said, the reason why he doesn't write short stories anymore is because you spend 6 months to a year writing it, and even if you publish it in a really great place, 500 people read it, tops, and 300 of them hate it because they also write short stories, right? So how do you sort of get around that problem that sort of increasingly everybody's in their little silos and they're not talking to each other, when literature is supposed to be like talking to a broader audience?
Yeah, well, it's actually really interesting, because the same thing happens. Now we have this trend of meetings of cultural managers, or the profession of like cultural managers.
What's that? I've never heard of that
That's
before.
the funny thing. I mean, cultural managers is someone like how you become the director of a literary festival. All the positions, the jobs that exist now, the job titles that exist now, like my own director of programming, that didn't exist, say, 30 years ago when we were kids. And in fact, the first person to ask me that was the director of the Buenos Aires Book Fair. She said, literary festival, actually, those are different things. Because one is very commercial. Book fairs tend to be like the Salon du Livre, have a very strong commercial publishing point of view. We're talking about the idea of literary festivals. And she was saying, how does one become the curator, for instance, to use another word, a literary curator? It's not the thing that you dream about when you were a kid, right? I mean, to think how to do this. And we realize that all through the Americas, at least on this part of the world, there's so many problems that are so similar. And we had at Blumet, actually, for the first time on the Friday of the festival, we had a journée professionnelle, where we had the director of like the Berlin Film Festival, a literary festival came, Brooklyn, Penn World Voices, like a bunch of really amazing people. And we were talking about these issues. And one of the key questions, actually, one of the panels was exactly that. There's way too much publishing. Like there are way too many books out there, way too many stories that don't get consumed the way that they would have in the 90s, that everybody knew who the latest author was. I mean, there was the canon was like established, and then you had the alternative, but now it's just like the quantity. I mean, everyone publishes. It's so out there, like, because again, it's not only limited to books. People like you, like they self-publish, there's also blogs. I mean, before, like when I was a journalism student myself, you either wrote for the Link of the Concordian if you were like amazing for the Mirror and the Hour, you had to like earn your space in that platform. Whereas my students have their own blogs and Twitter and Facebook, and they have like all these ways of expressing themselves without having to be affiliated to an institution or belonging to a certain niche or like a certain clique, that you had to, as I think the Gen Xers, we had to do that, So I think I see this radical shift. But I did a panel with two millennials. One of them was this indigenous poet, who sketched one, who part of his mission in Cusco, which is a town in Peru that's close to Machu Picchu. It's actually a pretty big city, and then Luna Miguel, who's one of the top up and coming writers and poets in Spain, and they've known each other for 10 years. They had a group on Facebook called Romantic Dogs, Perros Románticos, which is a verse from Roberto Bolaño, but they met in person for the first time here in Montreal. It was amazing. And Jorge is gay, and he was just saying about like the way that they interact with so many things, and he said things on the panel that were amazing, like Tinder's just gonna save the world, Tinder, yeah. He's like, what on earth is wrong with like just having I mean, like, but he said it in such a way exactly like we were reacting like Gen Xers. I'm like, I grew up with like wear a condom or you'll die of AIDS,
Yeah.
This is what the discourse that we had, So, and they're like, no, what on earth is wrong with just having random sex with everyone on the street? I mean, like, and it doesn't even dawn on you that to think of the mentality is so different because they have ways of expressing themselves or finding where people are located through their tracking devices. Whereas for us to find out, okay, if you want to bump into that guy, you had to know where he was, whereas now you just know through the app, and it's just all these different things that are these different trends that are emerging as a result of all the technology that we have. But also, most of all, the way to express yourself on Instagram, on Facebook, I mean, you have a platform that you didn't before, that you had to actually earn, and so I think in that sense it's a radical difference.
Yeah, no, it's funny you say that because Aaron Haspel, the New York philosopher, he says that what's wrong with our society right now is that all the people who used to be reading are writing, right? And it's the same, what you were talking about. But how did you, just a little sort of autobiographical, I guess, like, how did you end up in Montreal? Because, I mean, you speak Portuguese, you speak Spanish, you speak, like, how did you end up here?
Well, it's a complicated, but not such a complicated story. I now officially start my speech by saying I'm a Jew in the diaspora, so I'm a product of being like a wandering Jew. I'm a wandering Jew in the Americas, and that's mainly what accounts for my being so displaced. So I was born and raised in Brazil. My parents, so I'm a first-generation Brazilian. My parents are first-generation Argentinians. And then by that, my grandfather on one side is Sephardic from Turkey, on the other side, Ashkenazi from the Ukraine. But when I was 18 years old, actually, I went to an American school, and I really, really wanted to go to college. Even though my town has like
American school in Brazil.
An American school in Brazil, an international school that was, And in fact, the one in my city was the only one in all of South America, I would say, that isn't on a state capital. But my town has a lot of multinational corporations, so it was designed for the children of the CEOs or the people that would move back and forth, diplomats, missionary kids, a lot, So there was a lot of that, and
that must have been weird.
It was.
I have somebody in my department who grew up in I think Saudi Arabia or. Oh, I'm totally blind. I think it's Saudi Arabia. She grew up somewhere in the Middle East and Arabic, and she grew up in one of these American compounds. And so all of her pictures look just like you grew up in Indiana. They have like the swimming pools, the baseball diamonds, but you're actually in like this place where women can't drive, right?
Yeah.
So you're kind of in this very artificial world within. So was it like that, the school?
Well, the thing is, it's interesting because the city of Campinas, where I'm from, which is located an hour north of São Paulo. São Paulo is like the second or third largest city in the world. It's a monster city. It's a city that always terrified me, even though it's technically very, very close to. I guess it's like the New Jersey comparison to New York City, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up in the sort of New Jersey-ish type of thing. My town has the second largest university or the most important, rather, not so much that it's large, but as you know, in Latin America, the best public institutions the best universities are public, and the University of Campinas is the second biggest or second most important after the University of São Paulo. And so there were a lot of vibrant intellectual community, but it was a city that was always very dangerous. It was very, very dangerous, and but it was the mall rats culture was also like part of like what we imitate in South America, everywhere except the city of Buenos Aires that looks like Paris and imitates Paris, and it was like the safest place to walk, and I would go there every chance I got. because I felt very free in Buenos Aires. When I came here, when I was 14, to meet my cousins here, my dad's older brother immigrated here. He's a physician, and so when I was here at 14, I was walking on Prince Arthur, and I was just I remember like falling completely in love with the city, and knowing that McGill was here. But I wanted to study journalism, and so there was two things, because the journalism department at Concordia was pretty good, but also because I did IB, International Baccalaureate, I got a lot of credits given to me, so I managed to finish my BA in 3 years instead of 4, even though I was assigned to the 4-year program. But also, as well, I wanted to learn French. That was a top priority. And I got accepted at Princeton, actually, as well. When my parents said, they would pay for all my education, but they would say $100,000 to like go live in New Jersey. Like, really? Do you think it's worth it? I mean, why don't you just go to Concordia? And funny enough, one of my first introductions to the language laws of Quebec is that if you actually major in French, you're entitled to pay regular student tuition. I
didn't know that.
Yes, they will waive the rule. Is still valid. So I remember, my second summer in the summer of '95 here, reading Marguerite Yourcenar on one of these, campuses. I don't know if Loyola or McGill, and I just remember feeling so intellectual that I'm reading like all these amazing novels in French that I always wanted to read. And also because the journalistic tradition that we follow in Latin America comes from the French literary tradition. For us, journalism is a literary genre. And on one level, I was learning inverted pyramid, all the Anglo techniques, that also made its way into the journalistic practice in Latin America. But most excitingly, I was reading J'accuse by Émile Zola, and learning about the Dreyfus Affair with like these brilliant professors that we have at Concordia, that are unbelievable. I had people like André Roy, Catherine Mavroukakis, like the top writers of Quebec teaching there, Like my course with André Roy on Culture et Civilisation Québécoise was like a dream. I read Gabriel Roy, Michel Tremblay, like all these great names. I understood like queer literature in Canada, like the Quiet Revolution, like a lot of it really helped me understand Quebec. The major in French, études françaises. I did 60 credits, 45 for the major. There were points that, when I was taking really high advanced grammar, which to me was like a puzzle because my foundation in Portuguese is pretty strong and the Romance languages, I could handle it. But it was, parts of it were rough, but I loved every second of it. So then I did my master's and I left. And then I worked all over Latin America. Then I came back to do my PhD. But essentially, this is the city that my intellectual formation that I owe through here, the discussions, even moments like this. I mean, Montreal to me is my intellectual, it's where I gain my brain power, so to speak.
Yeah, I came of age in the Montreal of the 1990s as well, and I'm just wondering, what are your impressions of how has it changed in the last, because I look at my students now who are sort of the age that we were in the 1990s, and they're like 20 and stuff like that, and how do you think it's changed? Like, what has been gained, what has been lost, what's different?
Well, I think, in terms of the journalism department especially, I think it was really interesting because in the 90s we had the Link and the Concordian. I mean, I'm talking about the media coverage. Then we had the Israeli-Palestinian, these are the themes, and then the queer themes, and so a lot of the writers that I knew that I really admired back then, like say Richard Burnett, like they had these which for me was, so they were so openly writing about homosexuality and the alternative life, of what to us was alternative because it was a world that was in Latin America unspoken of. And in fact, it's really interesting because at Blue Med, I had 4 gay writers going out, 2 of them from Latin America on Saturday night, in a spring night in Montreal. And we were also with the Norwegian writers. And they were completely freaking out about like how unoppressed we are, because they were out on Saint Laurent with like sex right in your face. And I'm like, at that point, it was really funny because I was coming from the festival where we were discussing these ideas on stage. And I was kind of playing tour guide. I'm like, you have to experience this, And of course, like, my millennials were like ready to dance. And we went to this bar, the one that used to be Globe. And again, I never go out here anymore. I only go out when I'm in Latin America.
What is it called? I can't remember what
But it was like
called.
a Korean, like Japanese, that they have like, because we needed somewhere that was serving food, that had a dance floor. We leave it to my friend Juana. She found the perfect place that was 3 blocks from the hotel. And they were just losing it, And I said, well, that's because you missed our panel on Thursday, which is on a play called Somos Ici, the palindromes Somos Ici, which is, it's about 4 Latin American immigrants that reinvent themselves in Montreal. One of them is gay. And it's a really big deal for a Latino young man to be in Montreal coming out, a Latino gay man. And I saw it and I'm like, well, I don't manage, these are codes it's not my scene, but so I couldn't translate or explain much, but I thought a lot of it was right out there in your face. So I thought in that sense, it was still the same. And what was really interesting is that one of the people that was coming is a big financial journalist that did her BA with me at Concordia. We go back all the way, to the mid-90s. So in her head, Montreal is still that Montreal in the 90s, So she knew, where to go. And for her, everything was exactly the same, except now we're 40 out on Saint Laurent, exactly the same, with the immigrants rediscovering the city. I think Montreal, to borrow from the William Weintraub cliche, it's a wide open town, it's a very free place. And it's a place that, so I think that that's still the same. I think people still come and really experience a city that's wide open. That is the product of the Quiet Revolution, I think, you know. I was also explaining last week to all the Latinas, we were at the Cultural Summit of the Americas, and Melanie Jolie steps up to the mic, you know, and starts speaking Spanish. And it's probably a Spanish that she picked up, you know, as a French-Canadian girl in Cuba on some trip, you know. I'm assuming, you know. But she is like...
She's amazing.
She's amazing.
Really
And she's
like her,
every single thing that I want my daughters to be. Confident, you know. I mean, again, she's standing before Alberto Manguel, you know, speaking Spanish. I am afraid of speaking Spanish in front of Alberto Manguel, you know. And so, you know, she's like, hola, ¿cómo están todos? Like, you know, it's super adorable and confident. And I said, like, you have to understand the women of my generation, the French-Canadian women of my generation are such a particular, you know, like brand, and for lack of a better word, just their feminism and the way their confidence, they're just, I find the men are the counterpart to that, you know, like I think doesn't necessarily work well, because I think the women are very, very strong. These are the children of the feminists of the 60s, you know, including, like, which would have been my mother or your mom, like that generation. I mean, the people that were born in the 70s. So I thought, you know, and I'm explaining to the Latinas, you know, to all the ministers and the ambassadors, you know, explaining Melanie Jolie, because I'm like, what they're seeing, you know, like it's this beautiful blonde and dog. I mean, it's just, you know, you know exactly what I mean.
I campaigned for her, yeah. So no, she's amazing. Yeah,
she
she's
is
really great.
And I thought, you know, to me as an immigrant, to you know, finally to get to the bottom of your question, or you know, one of the things that what I feel about the city as an immigrant, I can't help but feel extremely emotional that the Ministry of Culture of our country is addressing the crowd in my language, or one of my native tongues. It's a very touching moment. It's a very Montreal moment. I think she's a Montreal girl, even though she's like what she represents as a
She's very Montreal.
She's very Montreal. Exactly.
Like very Montreal.
She is, and she's a poster girl for everything that I love about Montreal women, you know. And I think, and that's what I love about, you know, the prospect of raising my daughters here. I think is, I think there's no city like it, for sure, in the Americas, and certainly possibly not in the world.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think one of the big things, there are cities that I love a great deal. I really love New York. I really love Paris. Singapore, I absolutely love Singapore. But the big difference, I would say, or one of the really big differences with Montreal, is that for various reasons, Montreal is affordable, which has all these like amazing effects. Like, first of all, it's amazing because if you don't have a lot of money, you can survive here pretty well. But it also means that, and this is what I hear from New Yorkers all the time, and from Parisians and from people in London, that when the cost of living gets too high, because, you know, every chic and his, like, you know, friend are buying like $10 million condos, then it means you actually smoke out a lot of the interesting people that make a city fun to be in, right? So one of the things I noticed about Montreal, which is still the case, but is maybe a little bit less so now, is that in the 1990s, everybody who was like an artist or an aspiring writer or actor came to Montreal, because it was just, you could live on nothing, and you could try and sort of make your career. And most of them failed, you know, because most artists failed, but they were interesting people to hang out with, right? And so there was just this very high concentration of people here who were doing something different, right?
And it also, I think, 100%,
here.
I couldn't agree with you more. I just find the definition of failure is interesting, because the ones that made it were the ones that went to Toronto, New York, you know? And let's see actually what became of them, in the sense that, sure, they made it in terms of, but I agree with you, this vibrant culture and this idea that you can live on practically nothing, you know, which has its counterpart in the sense that it is conducive to, you know, just spending, you know, a week like drinking and smoking pot and doing nothing. There's not that pressure to produce,
Don't
you know.
you try it.
No, you know, guilty as charged. I mean, I'm saying that it's just.
I'm
it's
trying
just
it right now. So. Anyway, yeah.
Or no, or we invent, you know, fun things to do like this podcast, you know. But it's just really interesting because you do have. I mean, if you come from this, which I have a little bit from the Jewish side, from the being brought up with American values, you know, the productivity, the fact that if you're not producing, you have like this guilt, you know, and that's not good. I mean, it's not that it's not good. It's like if you want to slack off, quote unquote, then you do. But if you don't want to slack off and work, Montreal has the I'll do it tomorrow. Like, you know, you just see the deadlines passing by, and you can spend, you know, 10 years doing a PhD like I did, you know.
No, it can definitely be a downside. I see that, but I lived in Baltimore, as you know, for quite a while, and like one of the things I loved about Baltimore, and I will always love about Baltimore, is that Baltimore is like Montreal. It's a slacker city. So if you are in like LA and you go to like a party, people immediately judge you by the car you roll up on, right? If you're in DC, I've spent a lot of time at DC parties. If you're in DC, the first thing people want to know is how much power do you have? How much access to power do you have, right? In New York, it's another thing, right? One of the things that's amazing about places like Montreal and Baltimore is that you can meet somebody and know them and hang out with them on weekends for 6 months, and you know everything about their problems with their mother and their problems with their sister, and you know all this stuff about like their personal life and about what kind of movies they like and books they read and you know everything, but you have no idea what they do. Right, because people just don't say, "What do you do?"
Yeah.
It's not a natural question.
No, and I've always said, the question in Montreal is where
yeah.
you're from. If you had to do a one-liner question, is where are you from? Because very few people are actually from here, but never what you do. What do you do? No, and that's a very American question. What do you do?
What do you do? And I've always appreciated that. Though I agree with you, it can be a trap for a lot of people. It almost feels like in the Odyssey, in Homer's Odyssey, where Odysseus gets stranded on that island, and there's Calypso, and you eat these things, and you just go into a kind of a coma or sort of, and you're just chilling out, and you have no idea how much time has passed, and then his men become swine right on the island because they're just total slobs, and it's like you say, just smoking up and getting drunk, and you wake up and you're 35 and nothing's happening with your life, and you're like, what the fuck, and
then inevitably, that does lead to depression, all kinds of things. I'm saying just for not feeling like you're, and it's not so much about the American productivity sense of accomplishment. It's just that it's one thing for you to do that as you're taking a break. It's quite another if the break becomes a permanent mode of being, because then you just start feeling demoralized, I think, I don't know, it's but you do see what I'm talking about. There's no pressure to succeed here, that for sure. There's no pressure to be slim, there's no pressure to be to have money. That's one of the other things that my Latina friends come when they see when the comment on when they see on the street girls that don't have perfectly shaped bodies wearing small clothing or something in Latin America would never happen. Here it's and that's the thing, they're like, oh my god, this is so amazing, they're so confident. I'm they are, it's not, you're not really, there's certain enclaves, say for instance Victoria Park Gym on Westmount, yes, but that's or
Mile End. Everybody's hot here. It's
but I think everybody's naturally hot here. I think it's a different thing. It's not because for instance, I'm going to Brazil in July, and my girlfriends are pestering me about Botox and this and that. I'm I am so disconnected from that.
I'm pressuring Sebastian about that all the time. I don't know why he doesn't do it. Why don't you do it, Sebastian?
Why don't you inject botulism bacteria in your subcutaneous layer?
Well, so you come from Latin America, and that's fascinating. But you also mentioned sort of the Jewish tradition, which I just think is it's kind of fascinating. I agree with Nietzsche that if you were to exclude the Jewish intellectual tradition from the West, you would have pretty much nothing. So it would So how do you think, what is your connection to the Jewish intellectual tradition?
Well, that's actually so funny that you're asking this. Not so funny because Philip Roth died yesterday. I'm actually working on my first book of essays that has to do with Jewish identity or with my identity. And it's impossible to talk about it without talking about being a Jew in the diaspora, because that's essentially all the main questions of my life, and the way I go about answering and trying to answer them or answering them with a question in the Jewish tradition, have to do with that. The fact that I'm a Jew essentially first and foremost, and the way that I think and that I come from this type of tradition. My experience here was really particularly interesting because and this is something that that I will not ask that you edit out because I'm finally coming out with it, but in the summer of 1994, my first summer here, the genocide in Rwanda was taking place. And again, to go back to the militancy tradition, some of my Jewish friends and I were petitioning actively some Jewish organizations to intervene, and I got firsthand experience of the amount of racism that that you encountered, down to you're 19. Why don't you just go on the birthright trip? You look pretty hot in a bikini. Just go and get yourself a boyfriend on the beaches of Tel Aviv.
True. Yeah.
No, but it was just such a horrible in the sense that I thought, I'm going to go to Montreal, and everyone, and there's such a at the time there was the biggest, the largest amount of or largest Jewish population living. A Holocaust surviving population. Yep. That is a statistic that I never checked, but I know Montreal very well.
It's actually true.
It's true.
It's completely
true. Is it
true.
Still true today, or is it?
It's the Jewish community in Montreal is exceptionally conservative and Zionist, and they're the highest sort of number of living Holocaust survivors. That's completely
perfect.
true.
No, it's like, again, all the things you learn from John Faithful, by coming to his podcast. Yeah, because I'd heard that, but I never actually had that confirmed. It's just that also one friend of mine that was doing the MA was working on a project called Living Testimonies at McGill, that they were actually actively recording all the people that, because you would see them, people with tattoos, the numbers that tattooed on their arms. I'd never seen that in South America.
Yeah, and I had met like 10 Holocaust survivors by the time I was 13. And I'm a goy.
Right.
So,
you're a self-described goy, isn't it? Which kind of makes you Jewish in a way by saying it. But it's just interesting because I was so interesting. It was devastating because I was first of all, the way that they were talking about Rwanda was kind of like, I don't understand and I don't care to understand. Like, why are you using the words never again? And as you know, our city has a very strong intellectual connection to the genocide, from Gilles Courtemanche to like Romeo Dallaire being on the ground. Like it's a very Montreal reality. And I realized that from that up until the recent revival of this with the Limud Festival as well, like or the Netanyahu fiasco at Concordia, like all these things,
God, I remember that.
No, and that's the thing with the Jewish establishment. The one thing that people don't understand, the first thing that they need to understand about the lack of Jewish conspiracy. First of all, I've never been notified. If we're trying to rule the world, please, like my I haven't been told when and where, but I'd love
stealing
to.
Your checks.
I'm stealing my checks
and your Christian babies to make my own matzah.
And poisoning the water too.
That's important, but it's so poisoned here that it doesn't work.
That's it. So but it's I also experienced racism from being from South America or being Sephardic, and even like the Ashkenazi can be so ignorant that they'll say things like, but like they think Sephardics are from Morocco. I'm like, yes, there's some from Morocco. Mine have nothing to do with Morocco. Do you even know what Sephardic means? And they have like this racist like ranking of. There's always been in the Ashkenazi the German Jews, then the Russian Jews, and the Polish Jews. It's all like in the scale.
And Leonard Cohen talks about that in the favorite game. The different categories of Jew.
Yes. And that's the thing. That's again one of the things that I love about Montreal. Mordecai Richler and Leonard Cohen, that really and Irving Layton, like that really helped me come to terms with the dissident tradition, and Chomsky as well, because I met Chomsky here a couple of times when he was doing a lot of the militancy at Concordia, and he was the first person who told me like the essence of being a Jew is being a revolutionary that goes against the establishment. Everyone from Jesus to Spinoza to you name it. And to the writers from here, from like Leonard Cohen to Mordecai Richler, that are completely different traditions. One's a plateau writer, the other one's from the Westmount, but they all have this contesting the establishment, like Philip Roth. So I'm now writing about this because again, I think as well that there's a part of me that really wants to do this, and also that most of all though, I've censored myself for 25 years. There's things that I'm not allowed to say or that didn't want to say. I don't want to piss that person off. I don't want to, if the Jewish establishment doesn't like me, then they're not going to give me funding for this other stuff, which will happen. The same thing that happened in the Limud. But I also think that if I have to be true to myself and my ideas, and it's enough with the censorship. I'm saying we do everything very delicately.
Does the Jewish establishment have like a party line though? My impression is that I can think of few communities that are more divided, politically, religiously, everything. It just seems like a very, very diverse bunch. I've never been able to detect
it's so
a party
interesting
line.
That you mention exactly.
Like the most anti-Israel people I know are Jews. Okay. The most pro-Israel people I know are Jews, for instance. So I don't know. It's the most atheist people I know, the most religious people I know, Jews.
But I think that's not just. But that's not just a Montreal thing. And in fact, I think one of the jokes is like there's something like 2 Jews, 3 synagogues. It's kind of like because we disagree on everything. So this whole like the number one anti-Semitic thing that you think the Jews are trying to conquer the world is like the most ridiculous idea, because it's like we can't even relate to ourselves, let alone get together and conquer anything. So it's no, it doesn't happen. We have like diverging views, and we argue about everything all the time with each other, and don't and fight and.
So what are the things that you would point out that you've been sort of repressing that you
well, that's definitely one of them, so when I was 3 years later, a very good friend of mine was writing a novel about a very dark chapter of Jewish history in South America. It's the kidnapping of the Polish girls. There was a mob called the Zvi Migdal that would tell fathers of young girls in Poland that they were going to get married in South America.
I've never heard about this.
Yeah, it's a huge thing. It was by the just Google it. It's Zvi, like a ZWI Migdal, Migdal.
And when did this happen?
at the turn of the century, in the main
Okay.
the 19th century, end of the 19th century.
Oh,
For a period of,
okay.
like,
This is really weird.
Yeah.
Is this the part of the whole kind of white slave trade panic?
Yes, but it was white
Okay,
slave
but
trade. It's
the FBI got their first big break with the white slave trade kind of panic that happened at that time, and they got their big amount of funding and their mandate and everything came from that.
Mm-hmm.
And their second big one was with prohibition, but it was all. To my understanding was that it was all shown eventually to be a hoax.
No,
And it
and
was
the
like
South
all
American,
bullshit.
no, the
But in
South American
there
case,
was a
yeah.
real thing.
Not only, because this came out at the time that he was writing this novel, because if you're a prostitute, you can be buried in a Jewish cemetery, and a lot of these prostitutes got together and got money to create their own cemetery to be buried. No, this happened like in many. It happened mostly in Rio and in Buenos Aires, in the big port cities of South America, or of Argentina and Brazil. No, this was highly documented, and it's something that the Jewish community really doesn't like to talk about at all. And in fact, this particular journalist was the journalist that documented the entry of Nazis to Argentina, because he was writing a novel about Juan Domingo Perón in the 80s, and he got a scholarship at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, in which he had access to the entire Library of Congress. And he said everything that didn't imply U.S. security, and by accident, he found out that Juan Domingo Perón was selling the passports at the time for $15,000 US each. One by one, the entry was documented. In the end, he just released that information. He said, "Can I release it?" They're like, "We don't care. This has been 60 years, less than that, like 45 years or something like that." And he's the one that documented the entry of the Nazis. And he was obsessed with Jewish women, and all his publishers were Jewish. So he didn't want to piss off the Jewish community. So eventually he shelved that. But that book was funny enough. I'm the central character in both of them. I mean, like a fictitious me. So it's kind of like written, and obviously, I mean, I wasn't a Polish prostitute in the 19th century. My name was Sarah.
I'm not a Polish prostitute, but I play one, in novels. Yeah,
exactly,
so,
I play one in
yeah.
novels. But so it goes kind of like with interchapters, like the way that John Steinbeck wrote the Grapes of Wrath. On one, like I'm a journalism student appealing to the Jewish establishment to intervene in Rwanda, circa now, or at the time that it was written in the mid 90s. And then on the other, I was like the prostitute that was like sold. I mean, the young bride.
How would they get them from Poland? I don't
understand. No, because the fathers would say, okay, because there was a lot of anti-Semitism there. And so that's when the immigrants started arriving en masse. And so they would leave their families because the mob would say that we're going to marry them. We're going to arrange the marriage, which arranged marriages are the thing, and especially in Orthodox circuits. We're going to find them, they're going to go to South America and get married. And they would go, the parents would send the girls and then they would arrive and be sold into prostitution.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah.
That's absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
Wow. And that was a common thing in South America.
It was, and to the point that, for instance, even the word for trouble in Portuguese is encrenca. It doesn't exist in any other language, and the root of that is kranke in Yiddish, which means crabs, like venereal disease. So when they would say, like when they had crabs, they would say encrenque, and so that permeated into Portuguese as encrenca, like I'm in trouble, and things like that. I mean, there's many. That's the one that comes to mind, but there's a lot of like things that even permeated in the culture of Brazil from these prostitutes, and they eventually became very strong women. They became influential in the political scene and all of this. I mean, the bordellos became, because again, at that point, what else are you going to do? You're like a Polish girl that arrived in South America and sold into prostitution,
Wow.
Yeah. It's quite the story, and it's not a story that the Jewish establishment likes to talk about at all.
Why? Because they were instrumental in it?
No, they were, 1,000%, yes. And again, it wasn't
is
one
so
person.
interesting. I don't know why I've never
look it
heard
up on
of,
Wikipedia.
I don't know why I've never heard of this before.
You're finding it. There you go.
Because okay, because the reason why I ask is because the whole panic, that this is actually very, very interesting for a number of reasons. I'm just putting this together at 43 here. But like the whole white slave trade panic in Canada and the United States led to a huge sort of like war on terror type thing back in the day. And they made all these laws, and there were all these cartoons, and the cartoons always depicted these really, really unbelievably anti-Semitic, stereotypical pictures of a Jewish man with like a big nose and like, the whole look, stealing like these like young girls and selling them into prostitution and slavery and stuff like that.
And this was also at the turn of the 19th century? Like,
yeah, it's the same period,
wow.
same period. And and this was always the way I had learned about this, that this was a complete fabrication of the anti-Semitic imagination and very racist imagination, and that it wasn't real. And everything I've read about it, and what's the last book I read about this? It was James Moroney. James Moroney from Yale, Brown. James Moroney, his book Hellfire Nation, he has like 2 chapters on the white slave trade panic. And he says, we've looked into it. It was all like not real. But this is interesting. So you're saying in South America, this was real.
From what I know,
so
I mean,
that would kind of reframe that the story they were telling was wrong, but it wasn't like they were pulling it out of their ass. Like there was actually some sort of...
From what I know, in Sao Paulo especially, it's a very legitimate story. And again, it wasn't one, it was quite a few, the bordellos. But again, it's just a dark chapter in Jewish history, but there wasn't a panic. In fact, the opposite. It was very, it wasn't known at all. And actually, some of the people that stepped forward actually were the children of these prostitutes, actually, that then, because that would be... Because this broke out again in the 90s, but it was because one woman did a research on the cemetery in Rio that was created. It's a Jewish cemetery in Rio that was funded by these prostitutes so that they would bury themselves, because the community refused to bury them.
So why would you say that that's... I'm interested in this. Why would you say that that's like a part of Jewish history?
A part of Jewish history. Well, it's a dark chapter it's a dark chapter, I would say, of the Jewish diaspora. I mean, it's a story that, it's a particular group of immigrants where like the way that some Polish women ended up in South America, that wasn't the way that they were sent. I mean, it wasn't the immigration project. They were supposed to be married to nice Jewish men and start over from poverty, like, my grandmother, for instance, or both of my grandmothers for that matter. And instead, they were betrayed by their own community, and I know for a fact, I mean, the rigor of this journalist, I mean, again, now that you're mentioning it, it's interesting because I've accompanied him to do a lot of the research. I think that this is 100% real. Yeah. And not only that, but like he decided not to publish it because he didn't want to piss off the Jewish community, or because he had many reasons, including probably knowing about this panic and saying it's just going to get, we're just going to create the stereotype of the, the covetous Jew, like, selling their own women into prostitution, That's
crazy. Yeah. It's funny because I just finished reading with Annalisa, we just read Bill Browder's book, Red Notice, which is all about like crazy stuff that happened to him in Russia under Putin and everything. And but he mentions at the beginning of the book, he talks about how his parents were both Holocaust survivors, and they sort of got away. And his mother was, because they thought things were getting really, really dangerous, his mother was sent all the way across Europe and put on a ship to the United States when she was a little girl, to be adopted by a Jewish family in the United States. And this was in the 1930s, late 1930s. And, I'm trying to imagine, like, how horrible would it be if you take this sort of like underground railroad to a better life in the Americas, and you get there and you're like sold into prostitution. Like that would be, and they promised you would be adopted or married, and you end up being like, that's
and
horrible.
I think, this is one particular group, but there were quite a few of them. And again, as bad people everywhere, they're in no way representative of the Jewish community, but a lot of the experience, quite a few women were trafficked like this. It's interesting. The story you mentioned is also the same thing that happened to Dr. Ruth, the sexologist. My friend John Curtin did a documentary called Why the Jew.
She grew up in Israel.
No, not at all. She was sent, again, her parents, as they went to Auschwitz, they put her on a train to the United States. And then when John is asking her why, reasons behind it, because this documentary has to do with like the disproportion of Jewish accomplishment, meaning that Jews represent 0.2% of the world population, yet there's only 14 million or 13 million of them, yet 25% of Nobel Prize winners, some insane number like that in every single area.
1/3 of Ivy League professors.
One third of Ivy League professors.
Yeah,
one of the people
very, very high.
And it's really high. And Alan Dershowitz's intervention is brilliant, because Alan Dershowitz is the youngest tenured professor at Harvard Law, and he was talking about how the other students are just as brilliant, but he's saying this idea like this. He has many reasons, but then at the end he says, but there's not one reason. It's elusive. He said it'll it's, you can't really pin it down. But she was saying her answer, Dr. Ruth's answer, is that she said, imagine what it takes for a parent to put a little girl on the train to send her to the other side of the world, as they knew that they were going to their death, or they had a very, very strong feeling that this wasn't going to have a happy ending for them to separate from their child. And so she felt that she had to do something with her life because she survived that,
Mm-hmm. All right. So you mentioned before about being a wandering Jew, and I just wanted to sort of revisit that. The great German sociologist Max Weber, in the book that he wrote just before he died, he's one of those people who died of the Spanish flu that killed tons of people after World War One. I mean, it's so sad. You know, the guy like struggled with depression for a lot of his adult life. He was debilitated by it. Like he got nothing. This bright, brilliant person. He was debilitated by it for a really long time. He finally had found a way to manage it and was starting to produce like crazy and do all these great things. And then he dies of that flu. I mean, he was relatively young.
Awful.
He was like 50. And he died of it. But anyway, like the book that he was writing when he died was this multi-volume sociology of religion, and he wrote the first couple, the introduction to it, and a couple of volumes, and then he died. But he wrote the one on the ancient Hebrews, and I've always like found it like really, really fascinating because he says one of the great sort of cultural innovations of the ancient Hebrews was dealing with being a diaspora community, because generally speaking, you have the sort of the human norm is that all of your religion and all of your sort of system of meaning is totally tied to a place. So you are your poetry, your religion, everything is like, my God lives on the top of Mount Royal.
Right.
My goddess is the St. Lawrence River that flows through my veins, and like everything is connected to place. And so if you like displace the people, you get the Durkheimian like anomie, and you get every year you're fucked up and you have like you're totally messed up. And he says that the genius of the Jewish people is that they had their temple like destroyed, they were dispersed, and they found a way to make their religion and their culture portable, you know, with the Torah tradition and with everything. And so now you don't need to have like Zion. You don't need to have Mount Sinai. You don't need to
you just become the people of the book, and the book is your nation.
Yeah, and you become like, but even more than becoming people of the book, because of this stress on people memorizing huge chunks of the Torah and having people, then there's no real, I mean, you know this stuff, but there's not really, you can't compare, like rabbis and priests are a different thing, right?
Yeah, oh, for sure,
The ancient Jewish priests were much more like sort of Catholic priests, and they had sacred authority. They knew the mysteries, right? Now the mysteries, everybody has the mysteries,
Exactly.
unless you're one of those Kabbalah people, but like, like everybody has the mysteries. And so this gives the culture a kind of a portable quality, right? Which has, in many ways, kind of dovetailed nicely with the modern world, with globalization, and kind of made them ready for it. So I know growing up in Montreal and many other places, the Jewish community has been very, very important to sort of intellectual life in Montreal. I mean, is it the same thing in South America?
Oh yeah, I would say the same thing. Yeah, definitely.
Really?
Most definitely. Yeah. Because I was just telling someone the other day about my first introduction to like a power couple was the power couple from the São Paulo Jewish community that started and runs the most important, prestigious, like the Alfred Knopf, another Jewish publishing company of Brazil, which is Companhia das Letras, is ran by this Jewish couple, and they had more prestige than any of the other entrepreneurs or like, the people with a lot of money, because of the Jewish value on the intellectual life and all, and I would say all the top publishers and the people that control the publishing industry, not control, but the people that run the publishing industry, I think so many are Jewish, and I think it's because there's such an emphasis in asking questions and never being satisfied. I mean, I think that the intellectual tradition is such a part, two things, that, and also the encouragement of women to read and women to question. And I think that, I mean, at least from my experience, that I've seen in São Paulo, in Buenos Aires, especially when I think Buenos Aires and Montreal definitely are very, very similar in that respect.
Really?
Yeah,
oh, wow.
for sure. And even Borges, who was not Jewish, but a huge Jew-phile, I think all a
I've never heard that before.
I think, did I just make it up? But but he was like a huge lover of Jewish culture and Jewish tradition, and wrote a lot about Jewish, didn't write about Jewish mysticism, but was very influenced by it. And I think there is a strong influence, in general, just from a tradition of questioning in general, which is, I think, a very Jewish thing,
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's, Leo Strauss, the political theorist, he says that Western civilization has been defined by a constant struggle between Athens and Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Reason and revelation.
Yes,
so
yes.
in that sense, I would say I'm not Jewish or Greek, but my culture has been largely defined by Jewish and Greek
I think, I
ideas,
think both.
right?
I mean, all the cultures have it. It's just that the interesting thing, and this was my friend John tried to answer in his documentary, and he just explored it because, again, there's no answer, as Dershowitz says, elusive. It's the idea that it's just disproportionate because there's only 12 million, and Woody Allen and Philip Roth, and I mean, every single possible from, Leonard Cohen, like, I mean, it's one after another, is Jewish. And even though there's only 12 million in the world, when I first heard that number, I remember, like, I was a student here. I was like, the first question, how many Jews in the world? My first thought was like 250,000,000, quarter billion, 250 million at least. But when they tell you 12 million, you're like,
I had exactly the same experience. And, I'm kind of fascinated by misperceptions like that, because when you have them, like, for instance, another misperception I had growing up here in Montreal is my experience of the United States was primarily through American culture, through American movies, comedies, TV shows, and stuff like that. And I was a big fan of The Cosby Show and Eddie Murphy. And I actually thought that the sort of the racial breakdown of the United States is, I thought it was like half white, half black, and that, approximately, and that everybody else, like, Latinos and Asians and everything else, and they all kind of fit into, like, a little bit. But I thought so I was shocked when I found out that the United States was, African Americans are only like 8% or something like that. I had no idea. And I also had the same misperception about Jews. I was shocked when I found out, like, I imagined that it was way, way higher than.
And I thought, speaking of,
we call it the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Yeah.
We call it
and you think like the three main religions, even right now with the whole thing in Jerusalem happening, Islam and Christianity and Judaism, except that the numbers are so disproportionate because, we're talking 1 billion Muslims and I don't know how many Christians, but certainly not, 12 million, but Jews only 12 million. You think, there's Israel, there's Manhattan, and you think Buenos Aires again was a huge, pole of Jewish activity, but at its peak was 100,000 at its peak. Now it's like, I don't know, but it's way less, way less than that. And Sao Paulo, even like, Mexico City's 30,000,
Yeah.
And you think Mexico City has 20 million people, 25,
Yeah. It's funny. I don't know if you've read it, but there's a book called The Full Package. It's
No, I haven't read it.
By Amy Chow, and can you see, Sebastian, what it is? The Full Package. It was a best-selling book in the States, but it's absolutely fascinating. But it looks at sort of exceptional minority groups in the United States. So it looks at, if I remember correctly, Mormons, Jews, Han Chinese, and Hindu South Asians, if I remember correctly. But it looks at these four minority groups, like, punch way beyond their weight like crazy, right? And so they go through various sort of explanations to try and explain this, and they audition the IQ one, that these people have higher IQ than average, but they say, well, that doesn't explain, like, Mormons are basically white people that have, weird beliefs. But
it is really interesting what the South Park guys do with them, for instance. It's really interesting.
Yeah, but anyway, it's like they audition a couple, and then they come up with this theory about why, and it's absolutely
And what is the
fascinating.
theory?
Well, you can check it out. But they say in order to be a vastly overachieving minority, you have to have this special combination of a feeling of insecurity, constantly feeling like you are beleaguered, and it has to be like, a real credible threat, which all four of those groups can very much say is a credible threat. I mean, like, the persecution has happened to all four of those groups. You have to have a sense of superiority combined with a sense of threat, and what is the other one? Oh, and also this pervasive feeling that we need to be twice as good to get the same result. That we're not going to, like, nothing's going to be given to us because people are going to be, by definition, a little suspicious of us, or not going to like us and stuff like that. It's an absolutely fascinating book, but it says that. One of the conclusions of the book is they say that even if you were to completely get rid of all prejudice and all discrimination and stuff like that, you would not have equality of result because culture matters, and some cultures are, as a guy who grew up in Verdun, I know very much what a loser culture looks like. I grew up in one. Lots of people ended up in jail. Lots of people ended up spending not just a decade smoking weed and drinking all the time, but 2 decades, right? So I know that there are cultures that for one reason or another are very much conducive to kind of losing at the game of life and not being very successful, and there are others that are very very conducive to that. So, and those things are shaped by class for sure and other factors, but their point is that you would have to at some point pay attention to culture, right? That wouldn't be enough to just sort of try and eliminate these barriers. But,
I completely agree with you.
What do you think about that?
I completely agree with you. I mean, I certainly see myself and and the Jewish tradition, or asking, the questions that my friend was asking, because it's the same question he's asking in his documentary, and all of it fits. There is that insecurity, there's that cultural drive to succeed, the idea that you have to work twice as hard, to get the same result because you're starting from a lower point of departure. You're just. But what I think is also interesting is accepting, again, this is something that I deal with in my book as well, which is anti-Semitism, because there's been so much conversation about, the Holocaust industry or like these atrocious, ways of using the term anti-Semitism. And I thought I was very touched by this editorial by Howard Jacobson in The Guardian that talks about, one of the punchlines of it is anti-Semitism is like Jews know what anti-Semitism is, and to invent it would be a sacrilege. I think every single Jew has experienced it at some point or another. And I discuss one particular experience that I've had, but that was very that marked me a lot. Happened.
What was it? If you don't mind talking about it.
No problem, Akin.
Since you're coming out and
it's
everything.
It's interesting.
Right?
I am coming out. It's funny because I haven't spoken about this for such a long time. Or actually ever. But when I was in the school patio when I was 8 years old, I was playing cops and robbers with my friends, and I would always play with older kids. These were kids that were two grades above me, and one of the guys that everybody looked up to because his family was, they owned one of the largest shoe chains in Brazil, and he was very handsome. I was 8 years old, he was 10, and we would hang out sometimes after class, and we were waiting in the patio for our parents to come pick us up, and I just looked up to him like there was no tomorrow. And then one day we were playing cops and robbers, and he came to me furious, saying that his grandmother told him that I was evil, that I had I'm gonna start crying that I was evil, and that I killed Christ. I killed Christ at age 8, and that I had horns in my head. And so, I'm not even, straight out of the protocols of the elders.
It's so hilarious.
Yeah. No, it is. And it's funny because it wasn't a repressed memory at all, but at all.
Did you forget to shave the horns that day?
No, but this is really funny because what he did was then right after, and to me, I remember the whole scene. I was so, you've known me for how long, and I've never spoken about this. Actually, I never told my parents either. My parents don't know this.
Oh, wow.
And I told my best friend recently.
Mom and Dad. You're about to hear this, yeah. So.
No, it's just, but actually I have to tell you a funnier story, that's not funnier,
so
but like the conclusion.
So they said you had horns, and that you killed Christ?
I killed Christ, I had horns, and I was evil. They didn't mention that
Christ was Jewish, I guess.
No, I don't think, the funny thing is I didn't even know that I was Jewish at that point because I was raised secular. Well, I had some idea because it was an interesting thing, and I deal with all of that in the book because it's the introduction to like why I study cultural studies and why I do what I do. It's so grounded in that experience. And so what happened was he pulled out my ponytail and started raking like his fingers through my head, like searching for horns in front of everybody. Yeah. And it was horrible.
Whoa.
Yeah, and then the girls. I remember the girls.
This is like the Brandon Tina story, like anti-Semitic version. Like,
yeah. Like, and so the girls, I remember them saying, "Yeah," and that's strange. And I can't even repeat the words in Portuguese because that's actually a phrase in Portuguese I never use, But they said, and that strange way she speaks to her parents, which was Spanish, which had nothing to do with this, But I spoke Spanish at home in a country in Brazil, like nobody speaks anything other than Portuguese, and I was just, I didn't know what to make of it. So I remember I ran to the library, feeling so humiliated. And I went to the library, and I remember it's a practice I still have until today, that when I get nervous, I'll just randomly push, get a book from a shelf, and not randomly, sometimes very deliberately, to feel a certain way. I think literature, to return to your literature question, has the power to transport you into another world like no other media has. Like when you read a story, you actually go into that world. And so I pulled up.
This is clearly a function of Jewish culture. There are other people that do crack for this, right? So
well, actually,
transport you into another world.
It was pretty much. I can inject it.
Porn, crack,
but well, that's the thing.
I'm gonna go get a book. Such a nerd.
Well, the book exactly. Let me go But I do. It's funny because when I tell that story, I actually use the analogy of like my heroin, because I ran to the library with the despair of an opiate addict getting a fix, which is exactly what I was doing. And so I read Pollyanna's passage, when I don't know if you're familiar with that story, but it's a little orphan, and at one point she orders a doll. Well, she's an orphan at that point. Her dad was alive, and she orders a doll, and the doll finally arrives. I mean, sorry, that when the train arrives with the order, it's not a doll, it's a pair of clutches,
Oh, wow.
And then her dad, and that's the analogy of Pollyanna's, like her dad said, he teaches her to play a game, that it's a play, and it's funny, I know this in Portuguese because I read in Portuguese, but it's like the game of happy, which is just be grateful that you don't need clutches, and so, but it sounds so cheesy if you tell it. You have to read Eleanor Porter's retelling of it, but it's really interesting because years later, I had a very romantic moment with a man who was German, funny enough, and who decided to wash my hair one morning. And
to look for the horns surreptitiously.
That's so funny because no freaking idea.
I want horns. I actually do. But
I think it'll look so sexy,
so.
like the little pointy ones
awesome.
for Halloween. I mean, that'd be a total hit, Yeah, and so it's funny because I was so traumatized. I mean, I relived the whole thing, and it was kind of like a one night stand at the time, and I was just like, oh my god, I can't tell this guy because but I was freaking out because I actually had a regression. I looked down in the shower and I was seeing my shoes and my uniform and like this whole thing, and I thought I dismissed it, but it stayed with me. And it was interesting because I had to question my own drive to succeed. Is American values that I always think that I was like the Kafkian vermin, that wanted to metamorphose back into a human being. And I don't think so. I don't think any of that applies at all. I think the opposite. I think it gave me a keen understanding of minorities, of differences, of being treated poorly, and for me, for instance, people say you never question why your mom didn't have a Christmas tree in the house. I'm like, no, my mom's entire house is like Interlaubke, like furniture from Germany, like it looked nothing like your average living room in Brazil. Like, why would it have a Christmas tree? In my head, it would be a frontal assault to like her aesthetic sensibilities. Like she would not, the faux pine, and especially because it's not real pine in Brazil in the middle of summer. It's like no, like to me it was like a no brainer. Of course, she didn't have a Christmas tree, and. But I remember not telling my parents, and I remember feeling very hurt. But I also remember, this is not something that I want to tell in my story because it's just pointless, But I did see the boy again in my day. He's actually on my Facebook. He added me on Facebook. So did some of the girls. I mean, welcome to Generation
Can I Photoshop
X.
some horns on you and you give him a picture of it? Say, you really almost outed me that time. Oh my God, I was scared. Like, that would be awesome.
That would be amazing. That'd be really, really funny. But it's just
Sebastian, we got to do that, okay? Anyway, so you've talked to him, and did you ask him about that?
I never spoke to him again. I never mentioned it because I also think he's just a victim of this. I think he was just as fucked up about it.
Well, he just got it from his grandmother,
exactly,
right?
His anti-Semitic Italian grandmother, exactly, who just said that about an 8-year-old little girl that, like me, that what on earth was like the problem, and it was, I don't know, and it's and what I always, anyway, it's just something that I dismissed as like a typical tale of racism. What was interesting to me was mostly I was also equally messed up by the girls saying the thing about Spanish, because to me it was like the scarlet language, that I spoke that made me different, But what was interesting is that one day, I was at a swimming pool with like my friends were all like, older guys and hotter and like hot guys, and we were just walking, and I said, and I saw her and I stopped, and then I told the guy, that girl was really mean to me in grade school, and then he just dismissed us like, so what, she's short and fat and you're hot, and he just said it like that, and I just said, none of this is my own merit, how I look or being Jewish but I remember like just feeling this divine, I'm not saying vindication, but I'm saying all these things that are out of your control, and I also remember not being kind of angry that he called her short and fat also, because I think it's not her fault, like she was born that way, so I also saw, no, seriously, like when I just remember becoming really, really sensitive to all this stuff, and so, which again gave me an edge, to be able to talk about, I think, like, indigenous cultures, because you live it in your own skin and you're trying to understand where it comes from and what it is. But anti-Semitism for sure is something really, really real.
Yeah.
And that
it's so central to Christian culture from the beginning. And people say that it's only sort of,
John, it's so refreshing to hear you say that, because
you can look like in, right there. And I say this as a Christian, right? I mean, but like right there in the New Testament, by the time you get to the Gospel of John, it's, in the earlier Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels in Matthew, Mark, Luke, it's saying that it's a particular faction within the Jewish community that is against Jesus, the Pharisees, Sadducees, stuff like that. But by the time you get to the Gospel of John, then it's like the Jews. The Jews are doing this, and you can so clearly see that the Christian community, which has grown pretty large and sizable, by this point, by the sort of 80, 90 years, 100 years after the death of Jesus. And they're very much trying to sort of get the Romans off the hook. So they have Pilate wash his hands and say, this is not me. I'm just doing what the Jews want me to do and stuff like that. And like, yeah, I mean, right from the beginning, and in Protestant culture, Martin Luther was intensely anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
no,
very,
you
very,
see it,
it's very
and it's very
baked
real.
into
It's
the
very
whole
baked
thing.
into the second. It's also very real. I mean, so when you have, and even people denying that anti-Semitism exists, which is why I was so touched by Howard Jacobson's essay, because no, every Jew knows what it is, and it's not like, I mean, if you're gonna use it in the name of like Israeli atrocities, that's a completely different thing, and again, it's a separate conversation, but don't tell me that it doesn't exist, because it's everywhere. And not only that, I mean, this was a very particularly very strong experience that I had as a kid, but a lot of my Jewish friends, we'd go to like some salons, some places here in Montreal, and we just say like, watch them like after they have a few drinks and the way they're going to start talking, and sure enough, especially, I mean, my friend John would like want to tear his hair out because, like just the discussion of Israel, like the seamless transition from Jew to Israeli is like, whoa, like, well, these are two separate things, one is like a religion and ethnicity and nationality that you can't, just like the seamlessness, as I said, like as if you're talking about a singular thing, grouping all the Jews together, grouping Judaism with Israeli, or like, which is nothing to do with the, I mean, one is so it's a very complex conversation, and it's a very nuanced conversation, but anti-Semitism is a very, very real thing. It's a very particular form of racism, but I also think, it's interesting because in the film with John, Rabbi Pupko is saying a lot of things of like that. Basically, it's like summarized as they hate us because they ain't us type of thing, and that's that, the which there is some truth to that. And like, I mean, but he says stuff like, we're just a reminder of what they can never be, or what they never managed to be, which again is a theory, but it is this constant hatred, or this bothering, like the people that get very, very bothered by it, and you see it and you just don't understand where it comes from, but you know that it's very, very real. Whether you internalize it, I mean, what happened in my case, again, to me, it was like I was already so different from everyone else. My mom was an architect. She had me at 30. I spoke Spanish at home. To me, speaking Spanish at home and being from Argentina was already bad enough, because the Argentinians...
So you've been like a lifelong outsider.
Yes.
Like
yes.
That's awesome.
No, and
actually.
the other interesting thing is like this argument, this massive fight I had with the Peruvian, the Israeli ambassador to Peru, and the last time I was in Peru, because we were just sitting there. He's married to a Brazilian who converted, and but not Jewish. Obviously, she converted, and he's like a cold Israeli Sabra, like a Israeli Sabra. He was born in Israel. He's Ashkenazi, and he was saying like my sore spot, like he said, because I said because I wasn't raised with the Holocaust, in my head, and then he said his immediate first words were like, "You were so spoiled or privileged." I'm like, don't you dare, ever say that, but also. Like I just thought how like limiting to put this idea in or to just say that again from a Jewish Ashkenazi point of view. So my mom wanted my sister and I to have a completely spiritual experience of Judaism. Also, my mom's Sephardic, so she thinks a lot of Sephardics think they thought they were German, they didn't see it coming. Too bad for them, because we've been running away since the Inquisition. It's like we know not to trust them. It's like, and so she feels also that it was part of the German arrogance, the German Jewish arrogance, because the Jews of Vienna thought that they were it. Like the Vienna
but
Freud.
The vast majority of German Jews left.
Yeah, well,
like there was only 250,000 left.
Yeah,
By
exactly.
the end of the 30s.
By the end,
so,
it's mostly,
so most of them actually did get the memo and were like, "We're fucking out of here." Like,
yeah.
So.
But actually, some of them, like my friend John's grandmother, were the first to hop on the train. Like the Viennese Jews was like, "Oh, this is what's required of us. This is what we'll do." And they were, and she was one of the first, like in the first shipments. Because they were so patriotic, where they never thought.
Oh yeah,
from the very
it's
beginning,
one of the saddest stories.
Yeah.
I mean the relationship between the German Jewish population and German culture is one of the saddest stories of unrequited love. I mean, nobody loved German culture more.
Yeah.
Nobody was more obsessed and more into German culture than German Jews.
Yeah.
And they turned on them.
Yeah.
It's almost
it's
just,
unbelievable.
It's so
it's
brutal.
Unbelievable.
It's so brutal. Like it's because it's
and
not
even
as
when
if they were holding themselves apart. They were they were at the forefront
and
of
everything
German
from
culture.
everyone. I mean, if you see the Vienna of Freud again, like it was one violinist and university professor. I mean, the people that were, the Polanski shows getting thrown out of the windows, like the guy in the wheelchair that he turns over. I mean, because Vienna was like the most quote unquote civilized place on earth up until that point, and that's exactly where it happened. I mean, where it started, the epicenter of the whole thing. So, but it's precisely because of that, because they were so. I mean, Freud was, super German. Wittgenstein was super German. I mean, all the philosophers, all the intellectual powerhouses houses that were there were, were more. They felt more German than they did Jews, for sure, for sure.
And they all had their Theodor Herzl moment, right?
Yes,
Like
yes.
who was, obviously it's an earlier generation, but this guy's like super uber French and really believes like we've assimilated completely, we're totally. And then he watches Dreyfus get publicly humiliated, and he's like, "Fuck this," we need to get our own state. We need to get it. I remember reading The Jewish State when I was a teenager, and I was like, "Wow!" I mean, it's a very, very powerful sort of. You can read it in different ways, but I sort of read it almost as like romance. Like, here's this person who's like totally been in love with French culture and felt like, I've done everything for you, baby. I like, I converted. I like your parents and I like everything. And clearly you're never going to consider us completely one of you. Yeah. And you look at how much anti-Semitism is on the rise in France right now.
And in Germany for that matter. But yes, of course, in France.
In Germany too?
Yeah, as well. But in France, I mean, always, I mean, there's always like a thing. But yes, I mean, I would say in all of Europe, it's always a, but yes, in Germany as well. And what's really interesting also is like about right before Passover, the Washington Post published an editorial. I don't know if you read it. It was a girl that was basically dumped by two Jewish guys in Manhattan, and she's basically explaining how she's a WASP and how these guys dumped her because she was Jewish. I mean, she wasn't Jewish, and it is so unbelievably racist, line by line. You're like amazed at the tone deafness that she's. For instance, things that when she says, because she's such a good waspy girl that tries to like to belong. And one thing that she says is like, when we go, when I go to like religious services with them, I feel jealous that we're not worshiping together. I'm like, I don't know where you go because Jews don't worship together. Like it's like the guys on one side that were like where, but it starts like, I mean, right on the very beginning, she says things like, I'm the kind of girl that my hair is perfectly smooth and like meaning like no Jew-fro, like I immediately felt my hair becoming like, oh my God, I need the blow dryer and the hairspray, right away. And then she says, I clean.
The Washington Post published this?
Yes,
oh,
yes.
Wow.
And so you have to see this. At a very particular period, right around the time that Howard Jacobson wrote that article. And one of the lines also was something like right after, she says, I clean when I get nervous, meaning, or I start cleaning frenetically when I get nervous, meaning like the dirty Jews, But it was like one line after another. And then she has this thing about the Jewish mother becoming, like calling her and being like, and he calls her like nosy and meddly. I'm like, it's the exact opposite. Like the Jewish mother, yes, is overbearing, but the fact that she's calling you and including you to talk about her son is a good thing. She's bonding with you. It's like, why don't you get it? It's like, it's not that she's meddling. She will give you that space, but it's just that they are in your face because that's what our families are. And as are the Italians, except the difference between an Italian mother and a Jewish mother is the Italian mother says, eat or I'll kill you. And the Jewish mother says, eat or I'll kill myself. It's like,
oh my God, that's awesome.
Because that's, hence, the psychoanalysis and the guilt trip, that is a very, very clear, they're just as many, except one is a master mind of emotional manipulation. The other one will just slap you,
Yeah.
So, I mean, the Italian. So,
well, on that wonderfully cheery note, I just noticed the time, and you said we had to be like, it's 2:30. So anyway, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It's my pleasure, John. Always super fun to talk to you.
Please come on again.
Sure, anytime.
And, for our listeners, if you would like to support the Likeville podcast, you can like us on iTunes. You can share our podcast with your friends and enemies. And if you want to support us financially, you can do so at our Patreon account, www.patreon.com/Likeville podcast. Did I get it right? No. Sebastian's like, you fucked it up. Patreon.com/Likeville podcast. Did I get it right? All right. Well, thank you very much, Ingrid.
Thank you so much, John. It was a pleasure.
Take care.
Thank you.